Morning, everyone. We are up to Perek Zayin Mishna Gimel. Hamachel espanav katanim, one who feeds his children who are minors under bar bas mitzvah age, vesavadev, or his slaves, ben gedayla me katanim, whether they are adult, whether they are minors. He is feeding them truma. They don't know it's truma. He knows it's truma. They don't know it's truma, and he's feeding it to them. Of course, not allowed to do that. It's not his to do that with. And they're eating it unintentionally. So that's the case. He's feeding his young children or his slaves, whether they are adults or minors. That's case number one. And I'm just going to jump a little bit ahead of things because I think it'll be easier to explain the Mishna this way. The Mishna is going to tell us that in this case, you who fed the minors or the slaves, you fed them the truma, you will pay the karen, you will pay the principal, but no one will be paying the chomesh. You will not be paying the chomesh because you didn't eat it. They will not be paying the chomesh for the following reasons. The minors will not pay the chomesh for two reasons, or two possible explanations. One explanation is that in general, a minor is not held responsible for their actions. They don't receive punishments for their transgressions. They don't pay for damages that they cause. That's the halacha. And therefore, here too, this is not a situation you want to go have them pay for eating the truma, which they weren't supposed to. They're not responsible for that. They're not punished. They're not held responsible for their actions or for their damages. The person who fed it, he is damaging. He is basically destroying someone else's, the Kohen's property. And again, if we have a specific Kohen here that it belonged to, he's going to pay back to the Kohen because he's paying damages. But the child is not going to be paying damages. He's not going to be paying penalties because he's not held responsible for his actions or for his damages. Also, the Sefer derives from the words of the Torah that state the ish kiyechal kodesh b'shgaga, the ish, a man who eats the holy, meaning he eats the truma accidentally. That's what the Torah says. You got to replace with the principal and the fifth. Well, it says the ish, and the ish means an adult person. So we have the Torah excluding a minor from this halacha of eating truma accidentally. So we've got two possible reasons to explain why the katan is exempt. One possible reason would be because he's not responsible for his actions, not held responsible for his actions. And number two, the Sefer has a source from the Torah. That's the reason for why the katanim they're not paying their fifth. And although they're not paying the fifth, the person who fed it to him is not going to pay the fifth either because he didn't eat it. Now, when it comes to the servants, the slaves, this needs a little bit more explanation because essentially we're talking about an Eved Kanani, we're talking about a non-Jewish slave here. We're not talking about a Jewish slave, we're talking about a non-Jewish slave. Not a Jewish slave is a regular Jew. If he ate unintentionally, he would have the responsibility he would be responsible for his actions. And then we would have a case like we had before where an employer fed his workers or a innkeeper fed his guests truma. That we had in the previous Mishnah. But now we're talking about what's called an Eved Kanani, Gentile slave. And what's interesting is that a Gentile slave is actually a pseudo-Jew. He is actually obligated in mitzvahs like a woman. Now, if so, it would stand to argue that he does have responsibility for eating the truma accidentally, because if a woman would, she'd have responsibility for it. So he should be responsible for it. But the explanation, that's the reason why this slave doesn't pay, right? There's no payment of the fifth, and it's only the one who fed him is going to be paying the principal, is because typically a Gentile slave has no money. He doesn't own anything. The rule is Masha kana Eved kana Rabbi. Whatever a slave acquires, his master acquires it. So he doesn't have anything. He has nothing to pay with. That's the point. He has nothing to pay with. He can't pay. All right? He can't pay, but neither is the host who fed him going to pay because he didn't need it. So no one's going to pay the fifth. And the host will pay the karen, the principal, for the damages that he did. Now, what we have here is a big difference between, although the Mishnah put both the minor children and the slaves together when talking about this halacha, but as we see, the reasons behind them is completely different. And because the reasons are completely different, there are some practical ramifications for the difference between the slaves and between the children. And that is that, number one, the slave, we say the problem is he has nothing to pay back with. Well, it's possible for someone to go to a slave and tell him that I'm giving this to you to acquire to the exclusion of your master. I give this to you only for you to acquire, not for your master to acquire. If a person does that, then actually the slave acquires it for himself. He owns it for himself. The master doesn't own it. In that situation, were he to actually have something to pay with, he'd have to pay. Or if, let's say, what happens is that before the master pays for the principal, the master frees him. Now that he frees him, okay, he's like anybody else who can own property, and now he'll have his own responsibilities. He'll have his own responsibilities. He will now be responsible for the chumash for the fifth. He's going to be responsible for it because at this point in time, he has the ability to go ahead and own property. When he's a slave, he really doesn't have the ability to do so unless someone makes this exception. But from his own, he doesn't have the ability to own anything. So he can't pay. He's exempt from paying. But once he becomes free and he has the ability to own, then already he has to deal with the responsibilities of the action that he did. Because don't forget, he was responsible. Essentially, he's responsible for the action that he did of eating truma accidentally, just that he has nothing to pay with. And we understand that he's nothing to pay with, so he's exempt. And it's not, what's more than he doesn't have anything. He can't have anything to pay with. But if it comes out that he is in a situation where he could acquire because he became free and the principal wasn't paid yet, all right, now he has to deal with his responsibility for the action of eating truma accidentally. But when it comes to a minor, the minor is exempt. He's either exempt because he's not responsible for his action, or we have a verse in the Torah, and therefore he's always going to be exempt. There is a discussion. There is an argument that, let's say a minor were to damage something. What happens after bar mitzvah, bas mitzvah? Do they become obligated? So there's different opinions, but the opinion that we follow in halacha, in practical halacha, is that he's exempt. So therefore, at the end of the day, this child is exempt for his actions, and nothing's going to make any difference to change that. When he did the act, he was exempt, and that's where it's going to remain. Okay, that's the first case of the Mishnah. The next case of the Mishnah is ha'oichel trumas chutz la'aretz, one who eats the truma of chutz la'aretz. Now, we know that truma is called a mitzvah tluya ba'aretz. It's a mitzvah that is connected to the ground, and according to the Torah, that all those mitzvahs only apply in Eretz Yisrael. But there were rabbinic laws that certain areas would have an obligation for truma. So, for instance, the lands of Egypt, Ammon, and Moab, which border the land of Israel, were rabbinically obligated in separating trumas and maasros. The land of Babylonia, was also rabbinically obligated to separate trumas and maasros. And therefore, when those trumas and maasros are separated in these lands outside of Eretz Yisrael, they do have the status of truma. Someone who's not a Kohen may not eat them. As the Bartanura points out, were they to become mixed with regular grain, if you don't have 100 times more, it's going to forbid the entire mixture because it's meduma. It's a mixture of suffix truma, suffix chulin, suffix regular grain. Nonetheless, when it comes to the penalty of a fifth, that does not apply. The rabbis did not include that in their law of instituting these rabbinic separations of trumas and maasros in these areas. The penalty for a fifth, they did not include in that. The ha'oichel pachas mikazayis truma, one who eats less than the volume of a kazayis of truma. Now, that means like this. When the Torah talks about eating truma accidentally, by which we say you have to replace the principal and pay a fifth from chulin, from regular grain, that then will turn into truma when you use it as the compensation for what you did. The Torah talks about, the Torah's wording is, ki yoichal kodesh, when he will eat the sanctified. The Torah uses the word achila. Achila is the word for eating. The word achila, when the Torah uses the word achila for eating, it means the minimum amount that was eaten was a kazayis, the volume of an olive. What kind size olive? Separate discussion. But the point is that achila, if the Torah uses the word achila, achila means you ate the volume, what's called a kazayis, the volume of an olive. If you did not eat the volume of an olive, you did not do an achila. You did not do an eating that's described as achila. Therefore, if you ate less than a kazayis of truma accidentally, you did not do an achila. You did not eat truma. And therefore, it will not carry the laws that apply to eating truma accidentally. Because the Torah said when you do an achila on truma, that is when you have to carry the principle on a fifth. But if you didn't do a kazayis, if you didn't do the minimum eating, there's not going to be that law doesn't apply. So at the end, when that happens, now the Mishnah says, "Mishalem es hakeren ve'en mishalem es hachemesh." You pay in all the cases mentioned above. You pay the principal, but you don't pay a fifth. The person who fed the children or the slaves, the truma, pays the principal, doesn't pay a fifth. The person who eats the truma of outside of Eretz Yisrael, that person pays the principal, doesn't pay a fifth. If you eat less than the volume of a truma, you will pay the principal and not a fifth, because none of these have the law of the achila, of the eating of truma accidentally, where the Torah says you pay the principal and the fifth with all the laws that go along with that. Now, it's important to point out that this halacha that we said, when you eat less than a kazayas, you're paying the keren, you're paying the principal, you're not paying the fifth. So in all these cases, including this case, when you pay principal and you don't pay a fifth, as we had before, that means you're paying for damages. You damage someone's property, and now you have to pay him. You pay him according to the value. Now, but the only value that we say that a person is obligated to pay in the sense that a Beis Din would get involved in making him pay, which is when we talk about paying in the Mishnah, we mean paying, and you're going to, at the end of the day, have to pay. Because if you don't pay, the Beis Din rabbinic court will get involved and force you to pay. That is only if you damage or steal what's called a shava pruta, the value of a pruta. Pruta was the smallest coin at the times of the Mishnah, and it's that coin, it's that amount, that's the minimum amount where you are fully obligated to pay. If a person actually destroys or steals less than a pruta, there is from the point of your accounting with heaven, you should be dealing with it. You should be paying it back. Nonetheless, there is no obligation to have to pay it back. So if our Mishnah says when you ate less than a kazayas of truma, you're still paying for the principal, it has to mean that you may have eaten less than a kazayas, but it had to be at least the value of a pruta. If it was less than a kazayas and less than the value of pruta, you wouldn't be paying anything, because less than the value. That's the value of a pruta is an amount that a person does not have does not have an obligation to pay for. Doesn't mean you're allowed to go ahead and steal from a person or damage a person less than a pruta's worth, but to be obligated for compensation, that obligation does not apply by less than a pruta. So therefore, the Mishnah says in this case of eating less than a volume of truma, you're still paying a keren. It may have been a small amount, but it was valuable, at least the value of a pruta. And because of the fact that you're only paying the principal and not the fifth, which means you're paying for damages, v'tashlum in chulin. What you pay with is going to be chulin. If you want to use grain to pay for what you damaged, go ahead. But it's not going to turn into truma. Like we say, when you are obligated to pay the principal and a fifth for eating truma accidentally, there we say that you have to pay in produce of chulin, which will turn into truma. That doesn't apply here. Here, what you pay with is chulin. You want to use grain, you'll use grain, and it won't be, and you'll just pay with something that has value. It's not going to turn into truma, though. And if you don't want to pay with grain, you want to pay with money, go ahead and pay with money. It's up to you what to pay with. Once we say the payment is chulin, doesn't turn into truma, it can be anything. And therefore, being that this is a payment for damages, it's not the law of eating truma accidentally where you have to pay the principal and the fifth. If the kohen wants to forgive, he can forgive. It's all about compensating for his loss. In that situation, if he wants to forgive, he's allowed to forgive, and you're off the hook. Okay. Kuf Mem Daled. Prohibition against making the image of a human being, even if it's only for ornamentation, meaning it's not for worship. As the pasuk says, iti. The pasuk says, Hashem says to us, "You shall not make with me gods of silver, etc." But this making extends to not just making a god, but making an image. Now we'll see all the details involved in this. When we talk about here making an image, we're talking about an image that protrudes, like a sculptured image. And if a person did it, he'll get lashes. If he was warned and he still did it, and two witnesses testify about it, he would get lashes. When lashes, again, were administered. But let's say it was sunken. Okay, he wasn't standing out. It was sunken in relief. Or you used paints to paint the picture. Mutter, that is permissible to do when it comes to the form of a person. Let's say you have a ring, a signet ring, a signing ring, that has on it the seal with the form of a person. If on the signet ring the form of the person is protruding, you're not allowed to wear it. But if you want to just use it as a seal, you're not going to wear it, but you're just going to take it and use it as a seal, that you can do. But let's say in the ring, the form of the person was actually sunken in. You're allowed to wear it. For us or lachlim, but you can't use it to sign with. Because if you're signing with that kind of ring, the signing is that you're actually sticking the ring into something that's going to leave a sculptured form. Because then in what you're sealing and what you're signing is going to be protruding. That's that kind of ring where the form, where the signet is engraved in, and that's what you're signing with. It means you're signing into something. You're not going to be sticking it into ink and putting it on something. That means it's like in clay or something. You're going to stick it in, and now there's going to be this little picture, a little sculpture that's going to remain. That's forbidden to do. Okay, that's when it comes to the form of a person. For us, that sire the included in "Don't make with me" is also not to make the form of the sun or the moon or the stars. Because when it says Hashem says "Don't make with me," that also includes like the form of those who serve me above. You may not do this even on a tablet where it does not protrude. To make likenesses of other living creatures, like animals, or the form of trees and grasses, that you can even do in a protruding form. Okay, so here we have, when it comes to the stars and the moon, all the heavenly bodies, that's going to be forbidden even on a flat surface where they don't protrude. And if we're talking about the likeness of other animals or of other trees and things like that, that can even be done in a sculpture. Now, the Asr La says bias, one is forbidden to make a house, Tavnas Heichel, that actually is on the same plan of the Beis HaMikdash. Okay, you're making a house that looks like the inside of the Beis HaMikdash. Now, we're not talking about a little model here. We're talking about you're making a house. Because we know there are models of that. There are people make pictures of that. They draw pictures in order to show what it looked like based on the dimensions that we know of. Here we're talking about you're making a house. Achsadra, or you want to make a terrace, Keneged Ulam, like the Ulam, which was, again, a terrace area in the Beis HaMikdash. Keneged Ulam, which was the entrance to the sanctuary of the Beis HaMikdash. And the Chavetz Chaim exam, Pirish Rashi explains, Sheyarach by Esper v'Gavay Arboim, to have something that has a width of 20 cubits and a height of 40, kind of like a terrace, a platform of sorts. That was what the ulam was. One may not make a metal candelabra shal shiva kanim if it has 7 branches, which was the form of the menorah that was again in the Beis HaMikdash, the sanctuary of the Beis HaMikdash. You want to make less or more than 7, or if it's not metal, even if then you have 7 branches, what's is permissible. So if it's metal, you can't have 7. If it's wood, you can have 7. This is also included when we have this prohibition, don't make with me, that includes also don't make a form of the Beis HaMikdash, which is what we call the abode of the Beis HaMikdash, of Hashem. This applies in all places, at all times, both by men and by women. Have a wonderful day.